Hey, Corky here. Um, this is a follow-up remarks to my video on prayer, mentoring, and journaling. Um, Another important aspect, preparation for ministry, is reading and writing. And it is staggering, actually, to learn in your travels how many people there are working in the area of church ministry, human services, counseling, and these other very critical roles of people helping that have not read very many books. Now, we're at a particular weird time here in the world because of the internet, and people tend to stay on their phones all the time. I'm 67 years old. No question, I struggle with this. Most older people do because we come from the land of libraries and those things and bookstores, and those things are becoming quickly extinct. So the practice of going to uh, libraries or bookstores and getting the best books, uh, you know, that was my day. That's what we did. And it was amazing to me when I was in college how many students didn't go to the bigger libraries. They just would only go to the local library at their college. You just are not going to find any, uh, you know, original information if you just stay around the house. The only way you can learn is by traveling and going to these other places. And often when I was in college, and I attended college late because I was a high school dropout for rock and roll, and so uh, when I got to college, I was older than most of the students there, and they would often ask me about my research and how I did that, and I assured them, I had bibliographies of books um, to read. I mean, if Keith Green on his newsletter would talk about General William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, and tell stories about him, then that made me want to go further and find books about William Booth and Catherine Booth. And my wife and I, we did that together. Uh, we read those books about the Salvation Army, although we weren't Salvation Army people. But what the Booths had spent their life doing actually is mirrored in a lot of ways of mine and Kim's work. Because General Booth stayed in East London among the poor and the dangerous people, and forming bands with them, horn bands, things like that, uh, and feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and working with prostitutes and all that. He was in East London doing that, but Catherine was uh, more of a scholar than he, and she would speak at the large cathedrals promoting the work that they were doing together in the Salvation Army. And that's kind of been the way Kim and I have operated. I was always the one where, working with the thugs and dangerous people, and although she participated in that with me. She walked the streets of Boston with me at night with the kids. Uh, she went to Bolivia with me, when we were on the dirt floor in some of the most remote settings. She was there. She was in Atlanta with me in the warehouse, doing the music. And so we did things together, and I don't consider myself not to be a scholar, but she's a better one than me. And her speaking engagements and her teaching, you know, as far as the outside the United States, have focused on Europe and some in Asia. And mine has been primarily Latin America when we're outside the country. And so she has a long list of experience in Europe, and I have my experience in the United States and America, which Latin America is America. Don't say they're not Americans, because they are. It's South America and it's Central America. And that's a political point, and I know where I'm at. I'm in Alabama, sitting on a porch. But I reject the hatred that counts, you know, Latin America as not being American, because we took Texas from them. And it's just an ugly hatred that participates. I didn't mean to get into all that. But in terms of reading and writing, you've got to be well read. And I would see these guys in full-time study, college, graduate school. They didn't even know what a bibliography was. You've got to know what the main thinkers were saying about that, not just in Christianity and, you know, ministry, but also in every other field. You know, when I worked among individuals with intellectual disability, you know, I went to music therapy association conferences, and I found out who were the thinkers, and, you know, put it in a Christian context. People like Henry Nouwen was doing that very thing, and so I read as much of Nouwen as I could. Now, in the internet period that we're in now, there are more bibliographies available to you. In my day, somebody had one, they just gave you the paper, or it might have been in the back of a book. Now you can just search for bibliographies. But what I'm seeing is that people are not using that to go locate books and read them. They're going to some website, they're reading a chapter of the book, and then they're having to fumble through, you know, 20 ads. And then they may or may not read the second chapter, third chapter. But in my day, it was a book, you know. It had a binding on it. It had a first chapter, a last chapter, bibliography, references. And you could hold it in your hand, and you could read it, and it became a part of you. And then the book itself, as a possession, you know, was on your shelf. Still is in my world. So there's no substitute for reading and writing. Now, I was blessed because English was one of my strong subjects, you know, in grammar school and high school. I did better in English. Not that I worked at it. I probably made failing grades in high school in English, but I knew how to diagram sentences then. So that when I became a believer, I realized that my religion was all wrapped up in a book, the Bible. So reading was and is essential. Learning how to write. You know, I never wanted to be one of those public speakers who got up and read off a paper. I wanted to make eye contact with the people. I learned that from Charles Finney's writings. You know, you want to be looking at the people. He was a lawyer, so lawyers want to look. And so eye contact was very important for me when I would be speaking to people. I'd want to be looking at them. And this is a major part of my music philosophy is that you're not looking at a paper, you know, a music manuscript or tablature or anything when you're playing with other people. You're looking at them and you're learning to watch their hands. So that contact was not only a part of my ministry in the churches, but it is a very important part of my experience of music. Because being with people is really what it's about. I was raised by a pretty stoic father. My mother died early. And so I had a desire, you know, to be with people. And so that's true. And as many of my colleagues have said about me, they say, you know, when you're with Corky, you think he's just a dirty hippie. You don't know that the degree to which he's educated and can talk. And I'm very committed to slang among common people, common talk for common folks. And so I can fool you. You'd never guess if you talk to me in a Walmart parking lot like these old guys do around our truck, they wouldn't guess that I had a doctorate degree or that I had taught undergraduate and graduate studies in any field. And that's intentional for me. I plan on being a regular feller to people that I meet because I work with, you know, common people. But that doesn't remove me from the responsibility of learning to read and learning to write. Because the people that I would be speaking to in congregations or, you know, on the Indian reservation, if I sat with a medicine man or got to meet a medicine man, it was important that I had read the history and knew who I was standing in front of. Leonard Crow Dog passed away recently. He's a very important Lakota religious figure and political figure because he was one of the mediators at Wounded Knee 2. And so I knew the day at the Sundance when the ceremonial chief invited me to go back into the Rush Arbor to meet Leonard Crow Dog. I knew how huge that was. I knew that I was going to be standing in front of one of the most important, as well as troubled, as well as controversial historical figures that I'd ever met in my life. So, you know, I met Billy Graham, I met David Wilkerson, I met Corrie ten Boom, I met a lot of important people. But I needed to know when I went back there who this guy was. And the only way I could learn that for myself was to read the books of Native American history. And so I had done that. And so when I went back there, it was not a waste. It was not in vain. I stood, it's an honor, sir, to meet you, okay? And that was very otherworldly. Not too many white guys like me along my world and everything have ever attended a Sundance. You don't go just because you want to go to one. I was invited to stand in as a family member. And so that's a pretty big deal. So that has to do with reading. You've got to be well read. Read so you can be right on your feet. Not reading so you can look intellectual. It's about getting clued in on what you're looking at. And then writing. If you don't know how to diagram a sentence in English, you're not going to understand when you get into New Testament Greek or Hebrew how to diagram those sentences. And consequently, if you can't diagram a Greek sentence, then you will only have understanding of about 25% of the first two chapters of Ephesians. Because the first two chapters of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul is using all of these prepositional phrases, and he's using all of these grammatical structures and vehicles to say something very important that are not stated directly in the words. It's in the way he said it. And so pretty early on I realized in the used bookstores, my wife and I would go to used bookstore rather than going, to the mall a lot of times. And there we would find books, often old books, to get us, in our foundation as to what we're doing. And I followed that practice. And so she and I have been educators, now for many years. And we're reading the papers that students are writing, and we are shocked at the lack of writing ability that people have anymore, because they're texting all day long with their thumbs and fingers and all these broken sentences, or doing voice recordings to send to someone, and they're not correcting the grammar and all that. Consequently, and they're not writing papers. And so they can easily become deceived that the great people that they're following after are not doing that kind of scholarship. Many of them are, and they're just not telling it. And that was true of me. These local fellows would be asking me, or women would be asking me about an idea that I had that I'd spoken of. And they had no idea that I came to that within a formal educational setting where there were books read and papers written. But I was sharing it personally and spontaneously. And so it can be really deceiving. You think you don't have a scholar on your hands, and you do. And this continued even into California and everything. And because, I'm a blues guitar player who got saved, and I'm still that person. When my wife first met me, I was just a guitar player who was reading a lot of Christian books and beginning to get involved in preaching and teaching and things like that. And I still kind of am that person, because music has been such an important part of my communication involvement. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. This is awful long. And then I'm going to pick up on formal training on another one. Thank you.